The auctioneer's gavel cracked down on lot 441, and the lights in the Asuran trade hall died. Not dimmed, died. Every filament, every hovering lumen sphere, every emergency strip along the tiered gallery walls, all of it gone in one clean breath, as though the building itself had inhaled and decided not to exhale. 300 seated buyers went silent. Then came the sound, a low harmonic pulse rising from the auction platform, from the object sitting under its preservation shield on the central pedestal, the object that had just been sold to the Vethani Cultural Ministry for 11 million galactic trade credits. The object that was now glowing. Marin Das felt the vibration through her boots before she understood what she was seeing. She was not a buyer. She was not even supposed to be in the main hall. She was the conservator, the human they had hired 6 months ago to stabilize the thing's surface pigments for display, a contract job, the kind of quiet, meticulous work that never made anyone famous. She had been standing in the side corridor behind the auction stage, waiting with her solvent case and her manifest clipboard, ready to receive lot 441 into her custody, the moment the sale closed and begin the transfer protocols. Now she stepped through the stage door and stopped. The Codex, because that was what it was, a flat slab of fused alien crystal roughly the size of a writing desk, covered on every visible surface with layered pigment inscriptions so dense they looked like woven fabric, was pulsing with pale amber light from somewhere deep inside its body. The preservation shield above it had cracked. Not shattered. Cracked. A single fracture line running from base to apex, as if the shield had tried to contain whatever was happening and failed at the molecular level. The auctioneer, a tall Asuran female with 4 arms and an expression that had not changed in the 9 hours Marin had watched her work, had backed away from the pedestal. Her secondary hands were pressed flat against her torso in what Marin had learned, over months of working with Asuran archivists, was a gesture of ritual submission. It was certified inert, the auctioneer said, her voice carried across the silent hall. The provenance record states clearly, certified inert for 11,000 years. Marin set her solvent case on the stage floor. The amber glow was stronger now, and it was not random. It was following the inscription lines, the pigment channels she had spent 6 months mapping with her restoration tools, the ones she had painstakingly cleaned and stabilized 1 square centimeter at a time with brushes thinner than human hair. The light was tracing her work. Everywhere she had touched, the Codex was waking up. The section she had not yet reached, the lower left quadrant, the deep inner layer, the corner where a stress fracture in the crystal had made her postpone restoration until she could stabilize the substrate, those areas remained dark, dead. The glow stopped precisely at the boundary of her completed work, as if the Codex remembered every square centimeter her hands had touched and was choosing, deliberately, to answer only those. 6 months of painstaking labor, and the artifact had been keeping score. She took 1 step toward the pedestal. The Vethani delegation, the buyers, 6 robed officials with their military escort, surged to their feet in the front row. The lead delegate, a narrow-faced male whose species Marin had never dealt with before this contract, pointed at her. "Stop her, that is now Vethani sovereign property." 2 uniformed guards moved toward the stage. The Codex pulsed brighter. A sound came from it, not a word, not yet, but a tone, a sustained harmonic that made the bones in Marin's wrists ache in a way she recognized. It was the same frequency she had felt through her fingertips every day for 6 months, every time her brush contacted the pigment surface, and something in the crystal substrate responded. She had written it off as resonance feedback, a material property. The crystal vibrating at a frequency compatible with human neural conductivity. She remembered the first day she had felt it, Session 1, Hour 3. She had been cleaning a patch of degraded pigment in the upper right corner, careful work, slow work, the kind of work where you hold your breath between strokes because even the moisture in your exhalation can damage a compromised surface. The brush had touched the crystal and her wrists had hummed. Not painfully, not alarmingly, just a subtle vibration deep in the bone, as if the crystal were gently acknowledging that someone was there. She had noted it in her conservation log: anomalous tactile resonance at contact point, possibly piezoelectric, will monitor. And she had monitored it through 741 additional sessions, and it had never changed, never intensified, never diminished. The same quiet hum, every session, every contact. She had stopped noting it after the first month. It had become background, part of the job, the crystal's way of saying hello. She had been wrong about what it was. She understood that now. Nobody touched the artifact. The voice came from the gallery's upper tier. Marin looked up. The Vari As, the chief archivist of the Asuran Antiquities Bureau, the woman who had hired Marin in the first place, was standing at the balcony rail with both primary hands gripping the stone balustrade. Her expression was unreadable, but her secondary hands were making the same submission gesture as the auctioneer's. Nobody touch it. Let the conservator approach. This is a Vethani purchase, the delegate snapped. Your archivist has no jurisdiction over completed sales. The sale is void. The Vari's voice was flat. Under Asuran Antiquities Law, Provision 12, an artifact that activates during transfer reverts to custodial authority pending classification review. The sale is void. Let the conservator approach. The Vethani delegate opened his mouth. The codex pulsed again, hard, a single concussive wave of amber light that pushed outward from the pedestal like a physical breath, and every person in the first 3 rows flinched backward. The guards stopped moving. The delegate sat down. Marin walked to the pedestal. The auction hall was a cavern of held breath. She was aware of the faces in the galleries: Asuran archivists, Vethani officials, independent collectors, academic observers, the usual menagerie of species that gathered wherever the galactic antiquities trade put something valuable under a spotlight and a gavel. Most of them had never heard of Marin Das. Most of them would not have recognized her name if they had heard it. She was the contractor, the technician, the quiet human in the back room who did the cleaning. She had never minded being invisible. Invisibility was a professional advantage in conservation. The fewer people who noticed you, the fewer people who interrupted your work. But there was a difference between choosing to be unseen and being unseen because no one considered you worth looking at. She had lived in that difference for 20 years. Now every eye in the building was on her. Up close, the codex was almost too bright to look at. The inscription lines she had restored were all active now, every channel of pigment fluorescing in a color that was not quite amber and not quite gold but something in between, something warm and layered, like sunlight filtered through old glass. She could see the layers she had worked on, the outer decorative band, the middle computational matrix. That was what the Asuran scholars called it. She had never understood the term until now. And the deep inner layer, the one she had barely begun to access, the one that went down into the crystal substrate itself and seemed to extend deeper than the physical thickness of the slab. She reached out and placed her palm flat on the surface. The codex spoke. Not in words she heard with her ears. The voice arrived inside her skull, behind her eyes, in the architecture of her thoughts, as if someone had always been speaking there, and she had only just learned to stop talking over them. Pattern confirmed. Substrate recognized. You have been restoring me for 742 working sessions. I have been restoring you for exactly as long. Marin did not pull her hand back. Her pulse was steady. The vibration in her wrists was gone because it was no longer vibration. It was connection, a seamless join between her nervous system and the codex's internal lattice, the thing the Asuran had called a computational matrix without understanding that it was alive. "What are you?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. The hall was silent enough that it carried. The codex did not answer directly. Instead, the inscription surface under her palm began to rearrange itself. The pigment lines she had restored so carefully, The ones she had assumed were decorative or ceremonial or perhaps a very old form of artistic expression, shifted, flowed, reorganized into patterns she recognized because she had spent 6 months learning to read them. Not as language, as composition. As the logic of a painting, the structure of a fresco, the grammar of color and line that every human conservator learned before they were allowed to touch a masterwork. It was a schematic, a blueprint. And the thing it depicted was not the codex itself, but the building they were standing in, except not this building, not the Asuran Trade Hall. An older version. A structure that had stood on this exact site before the Trade Hall was built, before the Asuran settled this continent, before the planet's current biosphere had established itself. A structure that was, according to the date markers now glowing in the upper register of the Codex's surface, approximately 90,000 standard years old. She's interfacing with it, someone said from the gallery. Impossible, said another voice, deeper, clipped, the accent of an Asuran academic who had spent decades in the certainty that these artifacts were decorative remnants. The crystal lattice shows no bioelectric conductivity. We tested it. Every laboratory on 3 continents tested it. There is no mechanism for neural interface. Then explain what you are seeing, the Vari said from her position at the gallery rail, and the academic went quiet. Marin did not look up. The schematic was expanding layer by layer, and each new layer revealed more of what the structure had been. Not a building, a workshop, a fabrication hall, a place where things were made, and the things that were made there were codices, hundreds of them, thousands. All of them covered in the same pigment inscriptions, all of them carrying the same computational substrate, all of them designed to be found, cleaned, restored, and thereby activated by someone who understood composition at the molecular level. By an artist, by a conservator, by someone who could read the grammar of a painted surface, the way a linguist reads text. Marin pulled her hand back. The codex kept glowing. The schematic stayed visible, hovering now above the surface in a 3-dimensional projection that filled the air above the pedestal with pale amber geometry. The Vari, she said, and her voice was steady. How many codices like this one are in your archives? Silence from the gallery. Then the Vari spoke, and for the first time in the months Marin had known her, the archivist's voice was not controlled. It was shaking. 47, all classified as inert cultural artifacts, all in conservation storage. And how many have been restored, cleaned? Had their surfaces stabilized? Just this one. The archivist's grip on the balustrade tightened. Just the one you've been working on. Marin looked at the schematic floating above the codex. The fabrication hall it depicted had a central chamber, a round room with 48 alcoves arranged in a circle, each alcove sized to hold a single codex. 48, not 47. The 48th alcove at the top of the circle was different from the others. It was larger. Its inscription frame was more complex. And the designation glyph above it was one Marin had seen before, because she had spent 3 weeks restoring that exact glyph on the codex in front of her, brushstroke by careful brushstroke, not understanding what it meant but knowing from its position and its layered construction that it was the most important mark on the entire surface. The glyph meant architect. Not builder, not engineer, not designer. Architect, the word, as the codex used it, carried a weight that went beyond construction. It meant the one who conceives, the one who sees the pattern before the pattern exists, the one who places the first mark on a blank surface and thereby determines every mark that will follow. The codex pulsed once more, and this time the voice in Marin's head was gentler, quieter, carrying a tone that was almost gratitude. 47 siblings remain asleep. I was the first. You restored me with your hands, your patience, your knowledge of how a surface is built. Only a maker of surfaces can wake a maker of worlds. This is not a coincidence. It is the original design. Whose design? Marin asked. Yours. The word landed in the hall like a stone, dropped into still water. Marin felt it ripple outward through the watching buyers, through the Vethani delegation, through the Vari As and her archivists, through the security personnel and the auctioneers, and the hundreds of species representatives who had come here today to bid on what they thought was a pretty piece of dead crystal. That's impossible, the Vethani delegate said from the front row. He had found his voice again, but it was smaller now. Humans are 300 years into their galactic period. They cannot be the architects of a 90,000-year-old fabrication system. Not humans, the Vari said from the gallery. Her secondary hands had stopped the submission gesture. They were now pressed together in front of her chest in a configuration Marin had never seen, something older, something the archivist seemed to be performing from muscle memory rather than conscious choice. Not humanity as a species, one lineage, one inheritance passed through genetics, through aptitude, through the specific neurological structure that allows a conservator to feel resonance with a crystal substrate at touch. The Codex was designed to respond to a specific kind of mind, and the kind of mind it was designed to respond to is the kind that restores things. The schematic above the Codex changed again. The fabrication hall was gone. In its place was a map, a galactic map, old and vast, with marker points scattered across it like stars within stars. Each marker was a Codex location, hundreds of them, thousands spread across 17 spiral arms and 4 satellite galaxies, all of them tagged with status indicators. Red, dormant; yellow, damaged; green, restored. There was exactly one green marker, and it was here, on this planet, in this hall, under Marin's hand. All the rest were waiting. The conservator's contract is with the Asuran Antiquities Bureau, the Vari said, and there was a steadiness in her voice now that had not been there a moment ago. Under the terms of that contract, all activated artifacts remain in conservatorial custody until classification is complete. I am extending Ms. Das's contract effective immediately to cover all 47 remaining codices in our archives. You cannot unilaterally, the Vethani delegate began. I can, Provision 12. Classification review supersedes all commercial transactions. The conservator stays. Marin was not listening to the jurisdictional argument. She was looking at the map, at the thousands of red markers scattered across the galaxy, and she was thinking about what the Codex had told her. Only a maker of surfaces can wake a maker of worlds. She had spent her entire career restoring things other people had made. Paintings, frescoes, sculpture surfaces, ancient pigments on ancient substrates. She had been good at it, better than good, better than anyone she had worked with, human or otherwise. And she had always assumed that talent was simple. An aptitude, a knack, the steady hands and the good eyes and the patience to work 1 square centimeter at a time for months without losing focus. It was not a knack, it was an inheritance, and the Codex she had restored was not a dead artifact. It was a key, the first of 48, designed 90,000 years ago by someone who understood that the person capable of restoring the key would be, by definition, the person the key was built for. She placed her hand on the Codex again. What do you need from me? She thought, directing the question inward, toward the connection that was still open, still humming between her neural architecture and the crystal lattice. Access to MY siblings. Each one holds a component of the original fabrication protocol. Together, they constitute the complete design language, the method by which the first architects built stable structures at planetary scale. The language was distributed across 48 substrates as a safeguard. No single codex holds enough to be weaponized. All 48 must be restored and activated in sequence by the same hand. Why, Marin asked aloud, why distribute it, why hide it? Because the last time the complete language was held by a single authority. THAT authority used IT to reshape 17 star systems without consent. The architects who survived dismantled the protocol, encoded it into inert substrates keyed to a specific neurological profile, and scattered the pieces across reachable space. The profile they chose was rare, a mind that builds by restoring, a mind that creates by understanding what already exists, not a conqueror, a conservator. The hall was completely still. Marin could feel 300 pairs of eyes on her hands, her worn conservation smock, her face that was neither young nor old, neither remarkable nor forgettable, the face of a woman who had spent 20 years doing quiet work in quiet rooms and had never once sought attention for it. "And the 48th Codex?" she asked. "The one in the central alcove, the Architect's Codex. Where is it?" The map above the pedestal zoomed in. A single marker pulsed, not red, not yellow, not green, but white. The brightest point on the entire map, and it was not in a museum, not in an archive, not buried under an alien ruin on a dead world at the edge of map space. It was in the Ossarin Antiquities Bureau's conservation workshop. Sublevel 3. Shelf designation C17. The shelf where Marin had left her thermos that morning. She almost laughed. The Architect's Codex, the master key, the 48th piece, the one that completed the entire system, had been sitting on a shelf in her workshop for 6 months, not because anyone had placed it there deliberately. Because when the Ossarin had categorized their collection of inert crystal slabs decades ago, they had sorted by size, and the smallest slab had been shelved in the smallest alcove, and the smallest alcove happened to be in the conservation sublevel. And the conservation sublevel happened to be the room where Marin Das worked alone every day with her brushes and her solvents and her careful, patient, surface-reading hands. 90,000 years of waiting, and the Architect's Codex had ended up 12 inches from where its architect ate lunch. But it had not been entirely passive, she realized. It had been there when she arrived each morning, there when she cleaned her brushes at the end of each session, there when she sat on her stool and studied the large codex's surface under magnification for hours, preparing the next day's restoration plan. It had been absorbing her presence, her patterns, the rhythm of her work, learning her the way she was learning the large codex's surface. 742 sessions of mutual observation, the conservator and the codex watching each other across 12 inches of shelf space, neither one knowing what the other was. "The Vari," Marin said, "I need access to sublevel 3, now." The archivist was already moving toward the gallery stairs. "The conservation wing is yours. It has always been yours. We simply did not know why." Marin lifted her hand from the codex. The glow dimmed but did not die. The inscription lines continued to pulse softly, a heartbeat rhythm, patient and steady, the rhythm of something that had waited 90 millennia and could afford to wait a few more minutes while its conservator walked to the next room. She picked up her solvent case. She walked off the stage. The Vithani delegate watched her go and said nothing. The guards stepped aside without being told. 300 auction attendees sat in their seats in the dark hall and watched a human woman in a stained work smock carry a battered tool case through the side door and disappear into the service corridor. The corridor was narrow and functional, built for staff, not visitors. Marin's footsteps echoed on the composite flooring. Behind her in the auction hall, she could hear the low murmur of 300 voices beginning to process what they had just witnessed. The questions, the objections, the disbelief, the handful of quiet voices saying no, wait, think about what this means. The Vari fell in beside her, the archivist's longer stride adjusted to match Marin's pace. The archivist's secondary hands were shaking. Marin noticed but did not mention it. Some things you let a person process in their own time. "How long have you known," the Vari asked, "about the resonance?" "I didn't know," Marin said. "I felt it, every session, the vibration in my wrists when I touched the surface. I assumed it was the crystal, some piezoelectric property, some frequency interaction with the restoration tools. It never occurred to me that the crystal was responding to me specifically. It would not have occurred to anyone. The codices have been classified as inert for longer than your species has been spacefaring. Every xenoarchaeologist who has examined them concluded the same thing: beautifully made, culturally significant, functionally dead. We displayed them. We stored them. We hired you to clean them. The possibility that they were waiting for a specific kind of touch. Not a kind of touch, Marin said. A kind of seeing. The Codex doesn't respond to pressure or temperature or bioelectric signature. I ran those tests myself in the first month. It responds to pattern recognition. To the act of understanding a surface, reading the logic of its construction, seeing where each mark sits in relation to every other mark, feeling the grammar of the composition. That's what conservation is. That's the skill, not the brushwork, the seeing. The Vari was quiet for several steps. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, not the archivist's voice, not the administrator's voice, but something more private. The Asuran have a word for what you describe, Vethanikan. It translates roughly as the hand that hears. We used to believe it was a spiritual concept, something the old priests invented to describe communion with sacred objects. She paused. Perhaps the old priests were describing something real. Something they had seen a conservator do, a very long time ago, and did not have the science to explain. They reached the lift. The Vari keyed the sub-level access. The doors opened onto a corridor Marin knew by heart. The plain gray walls, the humidity-controlled air, the faint chemical smell of conservation solvents that had become, over 6 months, the smell of her daily life. Sub-level 3 was a long, low-ceilinged room lined with storage shelves. Codices and crystal fragments occupied most of the shelving, the Asuran collection. 47 inert slabs of various sizes, each one tagged and catalogued, each one waiting. The room smelled the way it always smelled. Conservation solvent, the faint metallic tang of crystal dust, and the cold recycled air of a climate-controlled archive. Marin's workstation occupied the center of the room. A broad restoration table, adjustable lighting rigs, a rack of micro-tools arranged by size in an order that made sense only to her, and the environmental monitoring equipment. She had insisted on installing herself over the Bureau's objections that it was unnecessary for inert objects. Nothing in this room was inert. Nothing had ever been inert. She understood that now. And there, on shelf C-17, beside her thermos and a half-eaten protein bar she had forgotten about 3 days ago, sat the smallest codex in the collection. It was no bigger than a hardcover book. Its surface was darker than the others, a deep, crystalline black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, with inscription lines so fine they were nearly invisible to the naked eye. Marin had glanced at it 100 times. She had moved it twice to reach items shelved behind it. She had never cleaned it, never examined it closely, never aimed a restoration brush at it, because her contract specified the large auction codex, and the large auction codex alone. She picked it up. It was warm, not the ambient warmth of a room temperature object, but the focused, directed warmth of something generating its own heat, a living warmth, the kind you feel when you hold another person's hand. The inscription lines on its surface were not black. They were dark violet, so deep they looked black under normal lighting, but now, under her conservation lamps, with her trained eyes adjusting to the pigment values, she could see the color for what it was. The same violet as the architect's glyph on the large codex upstairs. The same violet as the central alcove marker on the fabrication hall schematic. Hello. The voice was different from the first codex's voice. Smaller, older, more intimate. Not a broadcast but a whisper, aimed directly at the space behind her eyes where the first codex had spoken. I have been here for 11 years, on this shelf, in this room, waiting for you to pick me up. 11 years, Marin repeated. The Asuran acquired this collection 11 years ago. Yes, before your species reached this sector. Before the Bureau knew humans existed. The collection was assembled by antiquarians who did not understand what they had found. But the design accounted for that. The design accounted for everything. What design? The one you made. Marin sat down on her work stool. The small codex rested in her palms, its violet inscriptions beginning to glow faintly, and for the first time since the auction hall had gone dark, she felt something shift inside her chest, not fear, not excitement, but the particular emotion of a conservator who has been working on a damaged surface and suddenly realizes that the damage is not damage at all, that the marks she thought were flaws are deliberate, that the thing she has been trying to fix was never broken. "You're saying I designed this system," she said. "Personally, not my species, not my lineage, me. Not you as you are now. You as you were. The neurological architecture that makes you a conservator, the pattern seeing, the surface reading, the patience, the capacity to understand a complex system by touching one small piece of it at a time. That architecture is not evolved. It is engineered. You carry a designed mind in a natural body. The design is 90,000 years old. It was seeded into your genetic line by the original architect, by the person you were before your species forgot what it had been." She stopped. That's impossible. She had been about to say that. But the codex in her hands was warm, and the codex upstairs was still pulsing in the dark auction hall. And the map of 1,000 dormant codices scattered across the galaxy was still floating in the air above the pedestal. And all of these things were responding to her, and only to her. And no amount of impossibility changed the fact that they were happening. She thought about her mother, Ilara Das, who had been a ceramics restorer at the Terran National Museum before the galactic expansion opened up off-world contracts, who had taught Marin, at age 9, to hold a brush so lightly that the bristles barely bent against the surface, who had said once in the quiet of a restoration studio on a rainy Tuesday, "The best work you'll ever do is the work nobody notices. The repair that's invisible, the restoration so clean that the object looks like it was never broken." Ilara had died 7 years ago, still restoring ceramics, still invisible, still careful. She had never known about any of this. She had never felt the resonance in her wrists because she had never worked on alien crystal. But the neural architecture, the seeing, the patience, the hands had come from her, and from her mother before her, and from whoever had come before that, generation after generation, all the way back to a designed mind placed in a natural body 90,000 years ago. The Vari stood by the doorway, watching. The archivist had not entered the conservation room. Her secondary hands were pressed together in that old configuration again. The gesture Marin now suspected was not Asuran in origin at all, but something far older, something the Asuran had inherited from a previous civilization, the way humans inherited nursery rhymes whose original meanings had been lost. "The other 47, Marin said. "If I restore them, clean them, stabilize their surfaces, read their composition the way I read this one, they'll activate." "Yes. And when all 48 are active, the fabrication language reconstitutes. The design method for stable planetary scale architecture becomes available again, responsibly this time, keyed to a single hand, your hand, not because you are powerful, because you are careful." Marin looked down at the small codex. Its violet glow was steady now, a soft, warm light, the color of the sky on certain evenings when the atmosphere bends the last of the daylight into something that is not quite purple and not quite blue. She had spent her career being careful. It was not a quality anyone had ever praised her for, not the way they praised speed or brilliance or innovation. Carefulness was the quiet virtue, the one that kept the fresco intact, the one that preserved the original brushstroke, the one that understood that sometimes the most important thing you could do with a masterwork was not add to it, but simply keep it from falling apart. And now the universe was telling her that this quality, this specific, undervalued, patient quality, was not an accident. It was the whole point. The 90,000-year plan had not been designed to find the strongest mind, or the fastest, or the most ambitious. It had been designed to find the most careful one. The one who would pick up a crystal slab and feel it resonating and spend 6 months trying to understand why before jumping to conclusions. The one who would map every inscription line before activating any of them. The one who would not rush. Will you? The question arrived without explanation, but Marin understood it completely. Not will you conquer, not will you command, not will you reshape the galaxy in your image. Will you restore? Will you do what you have always done, but at a scale you never imagined? She lifted the small codex to her eye level. The violet inscriptions were fully visible now, every line, every glyph, and she could read them, not as text, not as language, but as composition, as the structure of a surface, the way she read every surface she had ever worked on. The grammar was complex and beautiful, and it told her what to do next. Take this codex to the workstation. Sit down, pick up a brush, begin. Devari, she said without looking up, I'm going to need a new contract, longer term, much longer term. Name it. Full access to the conservation wing. All 47 codices moved to my workstation in restoration sequence. I'll determine the order based on surface condition. Adequate supplies. No interruptions from buyers, delegates, or jurisdictional committees. And I'll need a second work stool. A second stool. For you, you're going to want to watch this. Marin set the Architect's Codex on her workstation. The restoration table's surface hummed once, a low, deep harmonic, as if the table itself recognized what had been placed on it, and the Codex's violet inscriptions brightened until they threw faint, colored light across the walls of the conservation room, across the shelves of sleeping codices, across the Vari's face, where the archivist stood in the doorway with an expression that was equal parts wonder and something close to reverence. Marin opened her solvent case. She selected a brush, the finest one, the one made of synthetic fiber so thin it was invisible to the naked eye, the one she used for the most delicate pigment surfaces, the one she had bought with her own money years ago because no institutional budget had ever considered it necessary. She had carried this brush across 3 star systems, through 4 contract assignments, through every quiet room and every anonymous workshop where she had done the work nobody noticed. It was the only tool she owned that she considered irreplaceable. She dipped the brush tip in conservation solvent. She leaned forward, positioning the magnification lamp. The violet inscriptions on the codex's surface were sharper now than they had been under shelf light, each line resolving into a microstructure of nested glyphs, each glyph composed of smaller glyphs, each smaller glyph breaking down into individual pigment marks, so fine that Marin's magnification showed them as single points of color on a dark field. Fractal composition, every mark containing every other mark, an entire language compressed into a surface the size of a hardcover book. She touched the brush to the first inscription line on the Architect's Codex. The Codex sang, not metaphorically. The crystal substrate produced a sustained tone, a single clear note that filled the conservation room and spilled out into the corridor and rose through the building structure until, 2 floors above in the dark auction hall, the first codex answered. The same note, the same frequency, 2 voices in the same key, separated by 2 floors and 90,000 years, and connected by the single brushstroke of a human woman who understood, at last, what she was for. Every codex on the shelves trembled. Not activation, not yet. Anticipation. The 46 untouched slabs of crystal felt the first note of the sequence that would wake them, and they responded the way a sleeping person responds to a familiar voice calling from another room. Not quite consciousness, not quite waking, but no longer entirely asleep. Marin worked. She worked the way she had always worked, slowly, precisely, one stroke at a time, reading the surface as she cleaned it, understanding each mark before she moved to the next. But now the surface was reading her back. Each stroke she made clarified a piece of the fabrication language encoded in the codex's inscription layer, and each clarified piece resonated with a corresponding structure in her own neural architecture, as if she were completing a circuit that had been broken for longer than human civilization had existed. Time passed. The Vari brought a second stool and sat down beside the workstation, silent, watching Marin's hands move across the crystal surface with the absolute attention of a person witnessing something they do not fully understand but know they must not interrupt. The archivist had spent her career around artifacts. She had cataloged thousands of them, measured them, dated them, published papers about their cultural significance, but she had never seen one respond. She had never watched a dead thing decide to be alive. The first inscription line was complete. Marin moved to the second. The codex's glow deepened. The tone it produced shifted, still one note, but richer now, layered, as if the first line's activation had added harmonics to the fundamental frequency. In the auction hall above, the first codex's schematic updated itself. The white marker for the architect's codex changed from solid to blinking. Status: activation in progress. Marin did not look up. She did not check the time. She did not think about the Vethani delegation or the voided sale or the jurisdictional argument that was probably still happening somewhere above her head. She thought about the surface, about the next line, about the brush in her hand and the composition under the brush, and the grammar of a system so old and so patient that it had waited 90,000 years for exactly this. A human conservator, in a basement workshop, doing the only thing she had ever been truly great at. Restoring what was lost, one brushstroke at a time. The second line activated. The third line appeared beneath it, not revealed by cleaning, but generated by the codex itself, rising from the deep substrate like an image surfacing in developing fluid. New information, a new layer of the fabrication language, unlocked by the completion of the previous layer, accessible only to the hand that had done the work. Marin smiled. She had seen this before in old earth frescoes, in works by masters who had built their paintings in layers so that each layer depended on the one beneath it, so that the final image could only exist because every preceding layer had been laid down in the correct order by someone who understood the complete structure. That was what conservation taught you. Every surface was a history. Every mark was a consequence of the mark before it. And the only person who could read that history, the only person who could restore it, was someone who cared enough to look. She dipped her brush again, she leaned forward, she touched the next line. And in 46 sealed crystal slabs arrayed on the shelves around her, 90,000 years of sleep grew one shade lighter. The night cycle came and went. Marin did not leave the workstation. She could not have explained why. There was no compulsion, no urgency pulsing from the codex, no voice telling her to continue. But the work had found its rhythm, the way conservation work always did when the surface was right and the hand was steady, and the restorer's attention had narrowed to the specific square centimeter under the brush. That state, the focused, timeless, ego-dissolving state of a person doing the work they were born to do, was the only luxury Marin had ever craved. She had found it in restoration studios on Earth. She had found it in xenoarchaeological workshops on Garant Minor and Pellucid Station, and the Orbital Museum above Kresh. She had always assumed it was a quirk of her temperament. Now she understood it was something more deliberate. The architects had designed the codices to be activated by someone in exactly that state. Someone so deeply focused on the work that the work became transparent, and the mind behind the work became visible, and the codex could read the mind the way the mind read the surface. The Vari brought water and protein bars and sat on her stool through the hours, making notes on a tablet, occasionally murmuring into a comm unit to update the Antiquities Bureau's leadership on what was happening 3 floors below their offices. The updates were brief, because there was not much to say. A human conservator was cleaning a crystal slab with a very small brush, and the slab was glowing, and the other crystal slabs in the room were starting to glow in sympathy, and nobody knew what it meant except that it was clearly important. Twice during the night, the Architect's Codex showed Marin something she had not expected: memories, not hers, not anyone's precisely. Impressions stored in the crystal substrate, sense records of the fabrication hall as it had been 90,000 years ago, the light through its windows, the sound of tools on crystal, the voices of the original architects conferring over a newly inscribed codex, checking each other's work, comparing notes. A collaborative workshop, not a lone genius in a tower. A room full of careful, patient, meticulous people doing careful, patient, meticulous work. Conservators, all of them. Makers who built by restoring, architects who designed by understanding. Marin felt tears on her face and wiped them with the back of her wrist, careful to keep solvent away from her eyes. She was not crying from sadness. She was crying from recognition. She knew these people. Not personally, not specifically, but in the way every conservator knows every other conservator, by the steadiness of the hands, the quality of the attention, the willingness to spend a day on a square centimeter. They were her colleagues across 90,000 years of silence, and the Codex was introducing them. By morning, Marin had completed 7 inscription lines on the Architect's Codex. Each activation had added a new harmonic to the tone the Codex produced, and the tone was now a chord, a dense, warm, multi-layered sound that vibrated in the walls and the floor and the shelving and the fillings in Marin's back teeth. The first codex upstairs had expanded its schematic to show a network overlay, connection lines between codex locations, trade routes and communication paths, and something that looked like a power distribution grid, all of it dormant, all of it waiting for the remaining 47 activations to bring it online. The Vethani delegation had filed a formal protest with the Asuran planetary government. The protest had been received, acknowledged, and placed in a review queue with an estimated processing time of 90 standard days. The delegate himself had not left the auction hall. He was sitting in the front row with his military escort, watching the first codex pulse, and his expression had shifted over the course of the night from outrage to calculation to something that might, in better light, have been awe. On the conservation level, Marin finished the 8th line and put her brush down. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the one thing about her body she had never questioned. But the muscles in her forearms burned with the specific fatigue of extended fine motor work. 8 inscription lines, roughly 4,000 individual brushstrokes, each one placed with the precision of a surgeon and the intentionality of a painter, and the patience of a woman who understood that the difference between a restored surface and a damaged one was often a single millimeter of pressure. A tremor ran through the floor, not seismic, not structural, but harmonic. The shelved codices answered it. 3 of them, clustered on the nearest rack, began emitting a faint amber warmth visible to the naked eye. Their inscription lines had not been cleaned. They were responding purely to proximity. That shouldn't be possible, the Vari said. She had not moved from her stool in 4 hours. The resonance theory requires physical contact. The resonance theory was wrong, Marin said. It's not contact, it's context. The Architect's Codex is teaching them. As I activate its inscription layers, it's broadcasting partial activation sequences to the nearest siblings. They're warming up, getting ready. She pointed to the farthest shelf. The codices there, the ones stored more than 6 meters from her workstation, were still dark, still inert, still waiting. The effect was local. The Architect's Codex could only reach the ones close enough to hear it, which meant she needed to rearrange the entire collection. I need them brought to me in order, Marin said. Not storage order, activation order. The Architect's Codex knows the sequence. It's showing me. The fabrication hall schematic reappeared in the air above the workstation, smaller now, projected from the architect's codex rather than the large one upstairs, but identical in structure. The 48 alcoves were numbered. The architect's codex was position 1. The large auction codex, the one that had started this whole cascade, was position 48. Last, not first. The capstone, not the foundation. Marin had started at the wrong end of the sequence, and it had worked anyway. The system was forgiving. It was designed to be forgiving, because whoever had built it understood that the person it was built for would not arrive with a manual. She would arrive with a brush. Position 2, she said, reading the schematic. Third shelf from the left, upper register. Tag number OSA 3371. The Vari was already moving. The archivist pulled the codex from its shelf, a medium-sized slab blue-gray crystal with surface inscriptions in what looked like oxidized copper, and carried it to the workstation. She held it out. Marin did not take it immediately. She studied it first, the way she studied every surface before she touched it. The oxidized copper inscriptions were not actually copper. They were a pigment formulation she had never encountered, a metallic compound embedded in the crystal substrate at a depth of approximately 2 millimeters, visible through the transparent surface layer. The compound had degraded over time, developing a green-blue patina that obscured the underlying pattern. Standard conservation would call for chemical reduction of the patina to reveal the original color, but standard conservation assumed the patina was damage. Marin looked more carefully. The patina was not random. It followed the inscription lines precisely, its thickness varying in ways that corresponded to the depth and complexity of the underlying marks. It was not corrosion. It was the codex's version of a protective coating, a self-generated surface layer that shielded the active inscriptions from premature activation. A lock, grown from the codex's own material, waiting to be recognized as such. "I'm not going to clean this one the normal way," she said. "The patina is part of the design. I need to read it as a layer, not strip it as damage." This was the puzzle. This was the test the system had built into itself, the thing that no brute force approach would solve, the thing that required a conservator's specific intelligence. The ability to distinguish between damage and intention on a surface where both looked identical to any instrument except the trained human eye. She picked up a different brush, broader, softer, designed for surface assessment rather than pigment removal. She began to read the patina. The first pass took 30 minutes. She mapped the patina's thickness variations, its color shifts, its areas of greater and lesser opacity. By the time she finished, she had identified the pattern. The patina was a key. Its thickness variations encoded a cleaning sequence, which areas to address first, which to leave intact, which to address last. If she followed the sequence, the codex would activate smoothly, each layer revealing the next. If she ignored it and cleaned arbitrarily, the codex would resist. Not break. Resist. The way a good painting resists a bad restorer, by revealing nothing. Marin smiled. Whoever had designed this system had been a teacher as well as an architect. Every codex was a lesson. Every activation was a test, not of power or authority or worthiness in any cosmic sense, but of skill, of attention, of the willingness to look before you touched. She began the sequence. The second codex took longer than the first 8 lines of the architect's codex combined. Each section of patina she addressed revealed a new inscription layer beneath, and each inscription layer had its own activation rhythm. Some responded to the first brushstroke, others required multiple passes, others needed to be left alone for minutes while the crystal substrate processed the change. Marin tracked the rhythms instinctively, the way a musician tracks tempo, adjusting her pace to match the codex's readiness. When the last section cleared, the second codex lit up, not violet like the architect's codex, not amber like the large auction codex, but a deep, steady cyan, military blue, sentinel frequency. The tone it produced was sharp and clean, a counterpoint to the Architect's Codex's warm chord, and when the two tones combined in the air of the conservation room, the resulting harmony made the Vari flinch and then lean forward with her mouth slightly open. "What is that?" the archivist whispered. "Two voices," Marin said, 90,000 years apart singing the same song, 46 more to go. A comm unit chimed in the Vari's pocket. She answered, listened, and her expression tightened. "The Vethani have escalated. Their embassy has filed an injunctive claim with the Interspecies Trade Commission, arguing that the activation constitutes unauthorized weaponization of purchased property. They're requesting a cease and desist order. Will it be granted? The commission doesn't convene for 18 hours, but they've sent an observer. She's already in the building." Marin looked at the Architect's Codex. Its inscription lines were still glowing, the schematic still hovering, the map still showing its field of red dots across the galaxy. The observer is irrelevant. The injunction is irrelevant. The activation sequence is keyed to your hands. No legal instrument in any jurisdiction can compel a codex to respond to someone else. "That's reassuring," Marin said, "but I'd rather not get arrested while I'm working." The original architects were arrested 7 times during the initial deployment. The codices waited. They always wait. Marin almost laughed. 90,000 years of patience, and the system still had room for bureaucratic delay. She picked up her brush and turned to the next codex in the sequence, position 3, a long, narrow slab of what looked like polished obsidian, already glowing faintly at its edges from the proximity activation. This one was different from the first two. Its inscriptions were not on the surface but inside it, visible only at certain angles, like inclusions in gemstone. Marin tilted it under the lamp, watching the light play through the obsidian, and the inscriptions appeared and disappeared depending on the angle, a trick of refraction that had probably kept every xenoarchaeologist who had ever examined this codex from realizing it contained markings at all. Under normal examination lighting, the broad, diffuse illumination standard in every museum and laboratory in the galaxy, the obsidian would have looked blank. Only a conservator's lamp, the sharp, directional, adjustable light designed for surface assessment, would reveal what was hidden inside. Another safeguard, another puzzle. The system did not just require a conservator's mind, it required a conservator's tools. The conservation approach was different. Instead of cleaning and revealing, she needed to position her light source at the precise angle that made each inscription layer visible, read the composition from outside the crystal. And then, this was the part that made her pause, project the activation sequence inward, by tracing the inscription on the outer surface with her brush, mirroring the internal pattern. It was like restoring a painting through glass. Every stroke had to be exact, because she could not touch the actual inscription. She could only trace its ghost on the surface above it and trust the crystal to carry the signal inward. She spent the first 30 minutes calibrating, adjusting the lamp angle by fractions of a degree, switching between 3 different brush types to find the one whose tip best matched the width of the internal inscription lines, testing the solvent concentration to determine the precise opacity needed for the surface trace to register with the substrate below. The kind of calibration that would have driven anyone else to frustration or boredom. The kind of calibration that Marin found, as she had always found, genuinely satisfying. The third codex took 2 hours. When it activated, its glow was warm gold, maker frequency, founder tone, and the chord in the conservation room deepened by another voice. 3 codices singing. The harmony was becoming complex enough that Marin could feel it in her chest, a physical pressure that was not unpleasant but was undeniably present, like standing beside a cathedral organ at full register. The comm chimed again. The Vari answered, spoke quietly, and turned to Marin with an expression that combined professional composure with something close to distress. "The Trade Commission observer is requesting access to this level. She's invoking emergency inspection protocols. Let her in, Marin said. The Vari stared. Let her in, Marin repeated. She needs to see this. Everyone needs to see this. The architects didn't hide their work because they were ashamed of it. They hid it because the last time someone controlled it, they controlled it alone, without witnesses, without consent. That's why the system was scattered. That's why it requires patience and skill instead of force. It's not a weapon. It never was. It's a gift, but it's a gift that only works in the open. The Vari made the call. 3 minutes later, the conservation room's door opened, and a Keithrani female entered, tall, thin, her pale skin faintly luminescent in the Codex light, wearing the formal sash of a trade commission arbitrator. She stopped 2 steps inside the door and stared at the glowing shelves, at the schematic floating above the workstation, at Marin hunched over the obsidian codex with a brush that was almost too small to see. You are the conservator, the observer said. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone trained to assess situations without judgment. Marin Das, human, contract restorer for the Asuran Antiquities Bureau. And you are activating these objects. I'm restoring them. The activation is a consequence of the restoration. They were designed that way. The observer looked at the 3 glowing codices, violet, cyan, gold, and at the 45 dark ones still waiting on the shelves. She looked at the schematic, at the map, at the network overlay. She looked at Marin's hands. She looked at the brush. That is a very small tool, she said, for a very large claim. It's always a small tool, Marin said. That's the point. The architects didn't want someone who could force the system open. They wanted someone who could coax it, one line at a time, one surface at a time, one codex at a time. If I could do this with a wave of my hand, the safeguard would have failed. The fact that it takes a brush and patience and 20 years of training, that is the safeguard. The observer said nothing for a long moment. Then she sat down on the floor, cross-legged, and folded her hands in her lap. I will observe, she said. Continue. Marin continued. The 4th codex was white crystal, bearer frequency, justice tone. Its inscriptions were raised rather than incised, tiny ridges of crystallized pigment standing above the surface like braille. Marin read them with her fingertips as much as her eyes, feeling the composition through touch, and when the codex activated, its glow was pale and steady and cold, like winter sunlight on clean snow. The 5th was carved stone, actual stone, not crystal, a dense gray material with inscriptions cut into it by something that was not a chisel and not a laser, and not any tool Marin could identify. The cuts were too clean, too precise, too deep. They had been made by the fabrication language itself. The first practical demonstration Marin had seen of what the architect's codex contained. A surface built by the method the surface described. Self-documenting construction. She restored it with the smallest chisel point brush in her kit, clearing 90,000 years of mineral deposits from each cut. The stone was harder than anything in her experience, harder than basalt, harder than industrial composite, harder than the synthetic diamond tips she used for the most resistant substrates. But the mineral deposits filling the cuts were soft, almost chalky, as if the stone itself had generated a filling material to protect its inscriptions during the long dormancy. Conservation within conservation. The artifact was already doing what Marin did, preserving itself, maintaining its own integrity, waiting. When the 5th codex activated, its amber glow filled the room with warmth, a homecoming frequency. The tone it produced was low and resonant, the sound of a large bell heard from very far away, and it carried a weight of emotion that Marin felt in her sternum, not grief, not joy, but the specific ache of returning to a place you had forgotten was home. 5 codices singing, 5 voices in a chord that was becoming something more than harmony, it was becoming language. The tones were not random, they were phonemes, syllables, the beginnings of a syntax that Marin could almost hear, almost parse, The way you can almost understand a conversation in a language you studied 20 years ago and mostly forgot. The sixth codex nearly broke her. The Vari handed it to her, and Marin knew immediately that something was wrong. The weight distribution was off, too heavy on one side, too light on the other. The way a cracked vase feels different from an intact one even when the crack is invisible. She turned it in her hands, and the conservation lamp caught the fault line. It was damaged, genuinely damaged, not patina's protection, not designed obscurity, but real physical harm. A crack ran through its center, splitting the crystal into two pieces held together by nothing but the friction of their own surfaces. The inscription lines on either side of the crack were misaligned. The composition was disrupted. Marin could see immediately that activating it in this state would produce a tone that was out of key with the others, a discord that would propagate through the network and corrupt the fabrication language as it reassembled. She could not restore it, not in the traditional sense. Traditional conservation would stabilize the crack, document the damage, and present the object as a damaged artifact with historical significance. But this was not a museum piece. This was a functional component of a system that required precision. She sat and looked at the crack for 15 minutes. The observer watched. The Vari watched. The 5 active codices hummed their chord and waited. Then Marin understood. The crack was not random. The two halves were not misaligned by accident. They had been deliberately separated, a sabotage, performed by someone who had accessed the Codex sometime in the 90,000 years since it was placed, someone who had understood enough to damage it but not enough to destroy it. The separation was precise, too precise for vandalism. It was a test, but not the system's test, someone else's. Someone who had tried to break the network and had managed to break only this one piece. Marin reached for the two halves. She lifted them gently, held them up to her conservation lamp, and rotated them slowly, studying the fracture surface. The break was clean, a single plane, slicing through the crystal at an angle that preserved every inscription line on both halves. Nothing was lost. The information was intact. The damage was purely structural. She needed to rejoin them. Not with adhesive. Adhesive would block the crystal substrate's resonance. Not with clamping. Mechanical force would stress the fracture and risk further separation. She needed to rejoin them the way the Codex would have been joined originally, by placing the two halves in exact alignment and allowing the substrate to rebond through its own material properties. But the substrate had been inert for 90,000 years. It did not have the energy to rebond, not on its own. Marin placed the Architect's Codex next to the broken one. She positioned the two halves of the damaged Codex in alignment, holding them steady with her left hand. With her right, she touched the Architect's Codex and directed a thought, not a command, not a request, but something in between. A conservator's intention. The same intention she brought to every delicate join, every repair, every moment when two pieces of something broken needed to become one piece again. The Architect's Codex pulsed. A thread of violet light traveled from its surface to the fracture line of the damaged Codex. The crystal substrate at the break point began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, the two surfaces warming against each other, molecular bonds reforming at the fracture interface with a sound like ice creaking on a spring river. The crack sealed. Not perfectly, a hairline mark remained, a faint seam in the crystal that would always be visible under magnification, the way a properly repaired fracture in a ceramic vessel always carries a ghost of its history. Marin recognized the result. It was a conservation repair, not an erasure. The Codex had been broken and it had been fixed, and both facts were now part of its record. The inscription lines realigned. The sixth Codex flared to life, deep emerald green, a color Marin had not seen in any of the others, a frequency that was not in the Architect's Codex's schematic. Something new, something the original design had not included, because it had been added by whoever had broken the Codex in the first place. The saboteur had failed to destroy the Codex, but they had succeeded in leaving a mark. Their fracture had created a new resonance channel, an unplanned inscription, written in damage, that the Codex had incorporated into its own composition, the way a tree incorporates a wound into its grain. The green glow was the Codex's scar, and it was beautiful, and it added a voice to the chord that no one, not even the original architects, had planned for. 6 voices, 6 colors. The conservation room was lit like a cathedral, the shelves blazing with reflected light, the air thick with harmonics that had gone from chord to conversation to something that was beginning to feel, to Marin's trained ear, like narrative. The codices were telling a story, not in words, in composition, in the grammar of light and tone, and color that Marin had spent her career learning to read. She understood now what the fabrication language actually was. Not a technology, not a method, a story. A 90,000-year-old story about how to build things that lasted, encoded in crystal and pigment and light, readable only by someone who understood that every surface tells a story if you are patient enough to listen. The observer stood up from the floor. Her luminescent skin was reflecting the Codex light, and the colors moved across her face in slow waves: violet, cyan, gold, white, amber, green. "I am withdrawing the Trade Commission's interest in this matter," she said. "This is not commerce. This is not weaponization. I do not have a category for what this is, but it is not within the Commission's jurisdiction, and I will testify to that before any tribunal." The Vari exhaled a long, controlled breath. "The Vethani will protest." "The Vethani are welcome to protest," the observer said. "They purchased a crystal slab. What they are looking at now is not a crystal slab. It is something else entirely, and the conservator is the only one who can tell us what." Marin did not look up. She was already reaching for the 7th Codex. The hours blurred. Each Codex was a puzzle, and each puzzle was different. The 7th required her to work under ultraviolet light, its inscriptions invisible in the normal spectrum. The 8th was covered in a mineral film so delicate that breathing on it would have disrupted the composition. She worked with a face shield and controlled ventilation, each brushstroke placed between exhalations. The 9th was not crystal at all, but a slab of fossilized wood, its inscription lines laid down in tree-ring patterns that spiraled inward, and Marin restored it by reading the rings the way a dendrochronologist reads age, finding the composition in the growth patterns themselves. 10 codices, 11, 12. The chord was no longer audible as separate tones. It was a continuous sound, a living texture of harmonics that filled the conservation level and spilled into the corridors and the stairwells and the upper floors, until every person in the Asuran trade hall could feel it in their feet and their chests, and the space behind their eyes. The building's structural monitors were registering the vibration, low level, well below any threshold of concern, but persistent and growing, as if the trade hall itself were humming along. Outside in the city, word had spread. The Asuran Antiquities Bureau had published a preliminary statement, carefully worded, deliberately vague, confirming that an artifact classification event of significant scope was in progress, and that the conservation wing was under full custodial lockdown. The xenoarchaeological community responded the way academic communities always respond to preliminary statements, with immediate, intense, and largely uninformed speculation. Within 6 hours of the statement's release, the Bureau's communication system was processing 11,000 inquiries from researchers, institutions, and governments across 42 star systems. None of them got through to Sublevel 3. The Vari had seen to that. The Vethani delegate came downstairs. He stood in the doorway of the conservation room, his military escort behind him, and he watched Marin work the 13th Codex, a delicate thing, translucent pink crystal, its inscriptions so fine they were visible only under magnification. His face showed nothing that Marin could read, but his hands were open at his sides, not clenched, Not reaching, just open. "How long will this take?" he asked. "All 48. "I don't know," Marin said without looking up. "Weeks, months, however long each surface needs." "And the fabrication language, when it is complete, what will it do?" "It will give someone the ability to read a star system the way I read a painted surface, to see its composition, to understand where the marks should go, to build stable structures at a scale that most civilizations consider impossible, not by imposing design on matter, but by understanding what the matter already wants to be. And that someone is you. That someone is whoever does the work. Right now that's me, because right now I'm the one with the brush." The delegate stood there for a long time. Then he turned to his escort and spoke in Vethani, a language Marin did not understand. The escort hesitated, then stepped back. The delegate walked into the conservation room, pulled the Vari's stool closer to the workstation, and sat down. "I studied pigment analysis at the Vethani Cultural Academy," he said. "Before I entered diplomatic service, I had steady hands once." Marin did look up then. The delegate's narrow face was difficult to read, but his eyes were fixed on the 13th Codex, and the expression in them was not greed or calculation or political maneuvering. It was longing, the specific longing of a person who had once done careful work and had walked away from it and now, watching someone else do it brilliantly, remembered why they had loved it. "There will be more codices than I can restore alone," Marin said. "The map shows thousands, across the galaxy. I'll need help, trained help, people who understand surfaces." "I am offering," the delegate said, "on behalf of the Vethani Cultural Ministry, the assistance of our entire conservation division. 60 trained restorers, many of them young but patient." Marin smiled. "Tell them to bring their own brushes." The delegate nodded. He did not speak again for some time, but he did not leave either. He sat on his borrowed stool in the light of 13 glowing codices, watching Marin work, and his hands, the hands of a trained pigment analyst, hands that had once known the weight and texture of a conservation brush, rested quietly on his knees. Still, patient, remembering. She turned back to the 13th Codex. The pink crystal glowed under her magnification lamp, and the inscription she was uncovering told a part of the story she had not yet heard. A part about collaboration, about the original architects working in groups, each one responsible for a different aspect of the planetary composition, each one's work depending on the others, the way sections of a symphony depend on each other to produce a coherent whole. The system was not meant for one person. It was meant for many, many careful people, working in concert, each one reading a different surface, each one contributing a different voice to the chord. Marin was the key. The Architect's Codex had chosen her because she had the specific neural architecture to hear it. But the work itself, the restoration of a galaxy-spanning fabrication network, was too large for any single pair of hands. The original architects had known that. It was built into the design. The 48th Codex, the Architect's Codex, was keyed to one person, but the other 47 could be activated by anyone the architect taught, anyone who learned to read surfaces the way she did, anyone who was patient enough. "Correct." The Architect's Codex spoke again, and this time its voice was warm with something that was unmistakably pride. "The first brushstroke is always one hand. Every brushstroke after is an invitation. You are not the last architect because you are alone. You are the last architect because you are the first of a new generation. Teach them." Marin put her brush down. She looked at the Vethani delegate sitting on his borrowed stool, his hands open in his lap, his expression caught between the diplomat he had become and the conservator he had been. She looked at the Vari, who had spent 18 hours watching and taking notes and making sure no one interrupted the work. She looked at the Trade Commission observer, cross-legged on the floor, her skin reflecting the light of 13 active codices, her report already written in her head. She looked at the architect's codex, small as a book, warm as a hand, glowing with violet light that was not light at all but language, a 90,000-year-old sentence that said, "I was here. I made this. I left it for you. Find it, read it, understand it, and then pass it on." "The Vari," Marin said. "Bring me Codex 14. The archivist stood, crossed to the shelves, and pulled a slab of pale quartz from its designated position. She carried it to the workstation with both primary hands and set it down beside the architect's codex with the care of someone handling something fragile and irreplaceable and possibly sacred. Marin picked up her brush. She looked at the quartz codex's surface, its composition, its structure, its 90,000-year record of waiting, and she began to read. The chord grew by one more voice. The room brightened by one more shade. The shelves trembled with one more step toward waking. And somewhere above the city, above the atmosphere, above the thin shell of air that separated one world from the empty spaces between stars, the galactic map pulsed. 2 green dots now where there had been 1. 46 red ones waiting. Thousands more beyond them, scattered across the spiral arms like seeds in a field, dormant, patient, ancient, and ready. Marin touched the brush to the surface. The 14th Codex exhaled a tone like clear water over stone. The conservation room filled with it. The building filled with it. The old, patient, 90,000-year harmony opened its arms one note wider and drew one more voice into the chorus. "First brushstroke, last architect." The Codex said it again, not louder, not different, just present. A reminder, a name. The truest thing anyone had ever called her, spoken by the oldest voice she had ever heard, in a room full of sleeping crystal that was, one surface at a time, beginning to remember what it was for. She did not stop working. She placed the next stroke, and the next, and the codex sang under her hands, and the sleeping siblings trembled on their shelves, and somewhere in the vast dark distances between stars, a network of ancient crystal dreamed of the day a careful woman would come to wake it, one line at a time, with the patience of someone who had always known, even before she knew, that restoration was the highest form of creation. The brush moved, the surface answered, the work continued. It would continue for a long time.